And I'm going to share my screen. And why is that happening? Get rid of that. Oh, no, I don't want that. Go. Okay, there we go. So maybe just, I don't know, Sandy, are you caught up? Do you remember the Mishnah that we're talking about?
I am. Yeah, I'm pretty sure. I mean,
okay, good.
The last one they posted was the 15th, so it's okay.
Right.
I'll catch up.
Fair enough.
But
Lisa, go ahead.
I'm struggling just to follow the train of everything. This is not the part of my brain that's really sharp. Could you give a tiny, just précis, just so I can put the puzzle
absolutely.
back?
Absolutely. So the first thing I want to do is just go back to the very beginning to the Mishnah, right? So Shnaim ochazin b'talit. Remember, we have these two guys, each of them who is holding on to the garment. Ze omer ani metzatiha. One says, I found it. The other one says, ani metzatiha. No, I found it. Ze omer kula sheli. This one says, it's all mine. Ze omer kula sheli. No, it's all mine. Right. And a couple of weeks ago, we went through what are the reasons why the Talmud has to formulate this case the way it does. But we're getting to the sort of important part, the two important parts, right? One, this one swears that he has no less than 1/2 stake. And the other one makes the same oath, and they split it, right? So in this situation, there are really two things that the Mishnah tells us to do. One is obvious. That's that they split it, right? That's the only, I guess it's not so obvious. We did encounter another possibility, right? Rabbi Yossi said maybe everything should just go in escrow until Eliyahu comes, right? But those are basically our only two fair options. Either they split it or nobody gets it, right? Because it's impossible to give the talis to one or the other because their claim is equal. And in terms of sort of basic Jewish law, possession is 10/10 of the law. And we've encountered this other competing notion, hamotzi mechavero alav hara'aya, the one who wishes to take away from somebody, the burden of proof is upon them, okay? Now, it's interesting that that phrase is literally about property, but that phrase is among the most important principles of Talmudic logic in general, which is if you wish to change the status quo, the burden of proof is on you to demonstrate why things should change. Unless we have compelling evidence, things should seem the way that they are, in whose possession the thing is. But what's weird about this case is it's in both of their possessions simultaneously. Okay. But the thing that's really animating the Talmud, I think, is the oath piece, okay? Which is to say, why are we making these people take an oath? Why not just say split it? What good does the oath do? Okay, and eventually we saw towards the end of that first section that Rabbi Yochanan comes along and says this oath is a rabbinic enactment. According to the Torah doesn't explicitly address this case, but were the Torah to address this case, or if you were to ask God's opinion in sort of rabbinic theological terms, God would say, okay, just split it. What's the big deal? Right? But the rabbis are concerned that that legal situation is going to enable people to be led astray by their worst inclinations, to go grab other people's garments and say, it's mine, and at least I'll get half of it, right? And because in order to prevent people from doing that, the rabbis are the ones who institute this oath in order to prevent people from going and snatching other people's clothes, okay? And so the Talmud's really thinking now about, okay, well, why do we make the oath in this case? And in what other kinds of cases is this similar to? Okay? And it's sort of that reason that we bring in Rabbi Chia. And I think, as I said last time, that Rabbi Chia's statement is the way the Yerushalmi begins its treatment of this chapter. That is all of this focus on language and the focus on, Ben Nanas and Rabbi Yossi and other potential ways that it could have gone. All of that is the Babylonian harchava, right? This sort of expanding nature of Talmud. In the original, right? If we were to go back in our DeLoreans to the time of the Amoraim themselves, really Rabbi Chia's is the way that the Talmudic commentary begins. Okay, and what Rabbi Chia is doing here is to sort of sync up what we know of our Mishnah and another classic case in Jewish law that he wants to compare it to, and that's the modeh b'miktzat ha'ta'ana case. Okay, the person who acknowledges a partial indebtedness. Okay, and that is if Sandy's back, so we'll tease him, right? If I claim that I loaned Sandy $100, right, and Sandy says, "Oh no, I only owe you 50." Right, that he's modeh b'miktzat, he acknowledges partial, then he pays the 50, but he swears on the rest. Okay, and this is what Rabbi Chia is focused on. Amar Tani Rabbi Chia. Okay, Rabbi Chia says, "Maneh li biyadecha." If one party claims, right, 100 of mine is in your hand, that is to say, I loaned you $100. The hala omer, and the other one says, "Ein lecha biyadi klum." You ain't got nothing in my hand, right? I don't owe you nothing. The ha'edim mi'idim, but on this there are witnesses, right, who say sheyesh lo 50 zuz, that in fact we know that we saw you pay back 50 of the 100, and therefore we testify that you owe him 50. Then noten lo 50 zuz v'yishaval ashar. Then he should pay the 50 and swear on the rest. Why? Shelo tehei hoda'at piv gedola ha'ada'at edim. In order that the admission of one's own mouth not be greater than the testimony of the edim. Right? Rabbi Chia here is explicitly, well, I guess implicitly, referring to the modeh b'miktzat ha'ta'ana case and comparing the notion of a case with no witnesses where the defendant partially admits, right? That case is being compared to our witnesses. The defendant doesn't admit at all, but the witnesses say, we know that you owe part, okay? So we sort of have a matrix of 3 cases being compared, all of which have, and you can see why they're similar, right? In which, to some degree, both sides of our Mishnah, the I found it, are each modeh b'miktzat, they each acknowledge a part, right? Because vis-a-vis the other, right? We who are watching this case see that, well, each of them seems to have a claim on half, but each of them doesn't have a claim on the other half, right? So this getting what you admit that you get and having to take an oath on the rest, it seems relatively parallel. And that's what seemingly Rabbi Chia says, V'tana tuna, and our Mishnah says, Shnayim ochazin b'talit ze omer ani mitzatiha v'chulei, right? And this phrase, Tana tuna, the Tana, the author of our Mishnah, is support for my claim that the case of partial admission is parallel to this case in which the witnesses say you owe half of the claim. Okay, and the Talmud now explains, whereas here, kevan detafis, when each guy is grabbing onto the garment, right? And I think we have to sort of imagine that they're grabbing equally, right? Such that it's sort of obvious that each one has a 50% claim. Then anan sahade, we, the judges, or we, the audience, or we, the abstract studiers of this text, we are the witnesses. Demai tafis hai didehu, that which this guy grabs, it belongs to them. Umai tafis hai didehu, and that which the other one is holding on to is really theirs. Vekatane yishava, and it teaches he should take an oath. Okay, and so that's the comparison. And what we did last time was to try to figure out, okay, well, is it really true that testimony of witnesses should be thought of as more significant than the admission of your mouth? And we found cases to one side and cases to the other. In legal cases, it's certainly true that we prefer testimony to admission. But when it came to spiritual things, right, bringing a korban, it seemed to be the other way around. So this is very confusing, Rabbi Chia. So as we begin this class, right, what the Talmud is going to do is having failed to successfully defend Rabbi Chia, the Talmud is going to start over and to say, Ki itmar v'tanatuna, when Rabbi Chia used our Mishnah as support for something, in fact, it wasn't as support for this claim that admission, a partial admission of a debt, is equivalent to when the witnesses testify to partially to what the not the defendant in English, what's the other guy's name? The
Plaintiff.
Thank you. In Hebrew, it's much easier because you just need to know Hebrew grammar. It's the tovea and the nitzba, the claimant and the one claimed upon. It's the same word, just in the passive and the active. The tovea is the one making the claim, and the nitzba is the one having the claim, being defending against the claim. Right, the plaintiff is the tovea, and the defendant is the nitzba. Right. So it must not be that case, okay, that it's actually a different case that Rabbi Chia is using our Mishnah to argue about, to be support for his claim, okay? And so this is the one that's going to be, right? That it was about a different thing that Rabbi Chia said. Now, this seems strange for us, right? That after a page and a half, the Talmud is suddenly sort of doing a 180 and going in a totally different direction. But I would just remind us that in a thoroughly oral culture, right, when we don't have a book that we look at to remind ourselves of what Rabbi Chia was talking about, this sort of, when we say the thing, Rabbi Chia's case, well, there would be 6 or 7 sort of famous things that Rabbi Chia once said about possession, and the differences are relatively slight. Right, so we've been sort of down this rabbit hole of trying to compare our Mishnah to Rabbi Chia's case, and it doesn't quite fit. So then we may be saying, oh well, maybe we've recited the wrong case of Rabbi Chia, and we need to remember some other case of Rabbi Chia, and that's exactly what we're going to do now. Okay, so forget about the witnesses and the partial testimony. Right, it's a different case, and this is what it is. Okay. De Amar Rabbi Chia, for Rabbi Chia said, Mana li biyadecha, right? If one says to the other, the plaintiff says to the defendant, the tovea says to the nitzba, 100 of mine is in your hands, right? I've loaned you $100 and I want it back. V'hala omer, ein lach biyadi ela 50 zuz. No, you only gave me 50. Vehelach, and here it is. Chayav, he is obligated to take an oath. Okay, in other words, he has to take an oath on the other half of the 50. Okay, and so this word helach, here it is the thing which is in question. What does helach mean? Literally, ha lecha, right? In Hebrew, ze shelcha, this is yours. And Rashi seems to imagine that he has the money in his hand, the very same coins that were lent to him. Okay, and to some degree, the force of his claim is, this is exactly what you gave me and nothing else, and here I'm giving it back to you. Okay? And nonetheless, this is a little bit weird, right? Because we would ask, well, why should he have to take an oath? It's one person's word against the other, okay? And this is in fact what the Talmud asks. My Tama, what is the reason? Why should this person have to swear? Because after all, if somebody takes me to court and says, you owe me $100, and I would say, do you have any proof? Because I've never seen you before in my life, right? And the person says, no, then nobody swears and nobody gets paid, right? Because there's no evidence on either side. Dara.
So the only difference in this case compared to the first one is that there are no witnesses. Is that correct?
Well, there are a couple of differences. So again, before we sort of had three cases. We had the case of Mishnah.
No, what I mean is the most proximate one that we just studied.
Right, so the most proximate, yes, exactly. The most proximate one is that there are no witnesses. That's one difference. The other difference is in the witnesses case before, the defendant said, I owe you nothing. Whereas here, he is modeh b'miktzat hatana. Maybe he is acknowledging partial. He's saying, I have 50 of yours.
I get
right? It. He's not saying I only borrowed 50. He's saying I have 50 of yours. These 50 are yours, and here they are. I hereby give them back to you. And so, but Dara, exactly right. You have anticipated exactly the connection the Talmud is making. What is the reason? And it says, Heilach nami kim modeh b'miktzat hatana adame. One who says, here you go, is as if they have acknowledged this partial claim. It's as if they're saying, you're right, I do owe you 50. And therefore, for the similar kind of reason, right? Because there's a better lie that you could have told, right? Which is, I've never seen you before in my life. I don't owe you anything. The fact that you say, well, I owe you, I do owe you, and I owe you 50, seems to suggest that there may be something a little bit more complicated going on. And that the fact that you didn't tell the better lie means maybe there really is some truth to the fact that your claimant is making this claim, and then maybe the legal system ought to respond. Remember, this is what Rava said about this case, is that we could understand the psychology of someone who, right, he gives the sort of psychology both ways, that people are not bold-faced liars to say to the person who did them a favor, I've never seen you before in my life, when in fact that person did loan you $100. Remember, these are Jews, and the Torah prohibits interest. So there's no good, right? That lending is a real favor. It's not like the lender is making 6% interest on it, right? And so the notion is that no, be such a bold-faced liar to in court in front of everybody lie. And yet simultaneously, they might be thinking, well, I really do want to pay you when I have the money, so I'll tell this sort of lie of, oh, well, it's less. I'll give you what I can give you now, even though they really do owe the money. And because of that, we impose this oath to sort of prohibit people, or to lessen there should be some consequence for people doing this. And in this case, as Dara sort of intuited, this heilach, this here you go, is pretty much like the modeh b'miktzat, the acknowledging of partial chov, a partial obligation. And v'tanatuna shnai mochazin b'talit, right? And this is we can learn that, right? That law, this notion of heilach, the here you go, is kind of like our case, right? Because the fact that the other guy is holding on to the other garment, half of the garment, is kind of like me saying, here you go, right? I've got my half, but here you go, because I see that you're holding on the other half. Okay, and now the Talmud will now explain this. V'hahacha, in our case, right? Kevan detafis, because they are holding on to it. Anan sahade demai detafis heilachu. Okay, right? That the part that the other one is grabbing, vis-a-vis me, it's as if I had said, here you go, because literally it has gone over to his hand. Vikatane yishava, and our Mishnah says you should swear. And therefore, given that our Mishnah says you should swear, even in this case, this concocted case of Rabbi Achia, where he says, heilach, that too should be a case in which we impose this oath. Okay? Now, unlike the other case, right? In this case, there's another opinion. Okay, it's not just Rabbi Chia's opinion about this case, because here we have Rav Sheshet. Right? Rav Sheshet Amar Helach Patur. Rav Sheshet says, in this case of you owe me 100, and the guy says, I only owe you 50, and here you go. That person is exempt from taking an oath. So Rabbi Chia thinks you do have to take the oath, and Rav Sheshet thinks you don't have to take the oath. Okay? To which, okay, fine. My Tama, so the Talmud now, having defended Rabbi Chia, now wants to make Rav Sheshet make sense. Okay, and this is the normal procedure. We are welcome to agree with Rabbi Chia. We're welcome to agree with Rav Sheshet, but we have to make them both make sense. They each have to be internally consistent. They have to each be logical. Right? The Talmud's happy for you to be wrong, but you have to make sense. Okay. So my Tama, why is it that Rav Sheshet would think that in this case of Helach that you don't have to take an oath? Okay. Kevanda Amar la le Helach. Okay, since this person says these words, Helach, here you go. Hane zuze to come mode begavaihu. Right, these zuzim, these coins that he admits to owing. Okay, it's as if they were already in the hands of the creditor. Okay. But with regard to the other 50, halo mode, he doesn't acknowledge at all. Hilkach leka hoda'a miktzat hata'ana, and therefore it's not acknowledging a partial amount of the claim. So to some degree, this word helach is really the linchpin here. Rabbi Chia thinks that when you say helach, that here you go, right? It's acknowledging you gave them to me, and now I'm giving them back to you, and that's a modeh b'miktzat. Whereas Rav Sheshet would say that's not what here you go means. It means they're not mine; these are yours. I'm not giving them back; they're yours. Take them. And therefore, he's not making, it's not a partial admission of the 100. It's actually split down the middle. Okay. To which the Talmud says, wait a second, that doesn't make any sense. Rav Sheshet kashia matnitin. Our Mishnah, which of course Rabbi is the whole point of bringing Rabbi Chia here, our Mishnah shows that you should have to take an oath, right? It's directly parallel. The me having half of the garment and you having half of the garment, right? The fact that you have half of the garment doesn't get me out of my need to take the oath, because our Mishnah says you have to take the oath. Okay, so that's a problem for Rav Sheshet. Rabbi Chia makes sense, but Rav Sheshet's got a problem. To which the Talmud says, Amar lach Rav Sheshet. Rav Sheshet could say, and here just a quick little sort of academic Talmud note. If you looked in the Art Scroll translation, which I don't recommend, it would say Rav Sheshet said back, right, as if this discussion were happening live with Rabbi Chia and Rav Sheshet in the room, and the back and forth is in their own time. Right? It doesn't say Amar Rav Sheshet, it says Amar Lach Rav Sheshet. And this Amar Lach, it means Rav Sheshet could say. If Rav Sheshet were now around, even though he's been dead for 500 years, right, he would give the following argument. This is not a conversation that's happening live. This is a conversation that's happening at the end of the Talmudic period by the Stam, by the anonymous voice of the Talmud, who is juxtaposing these opinions, neither of whom was taught particularly in conjunction with our Mishnah. Remember, we've sort of rewritten the Rabbi Chia thing to connect it to our Mishnah. Certainly, Rav Sheshet had nothing to do with our Mishnah. Okay, so of course, having challenged Rav Sheshet, we need to now come up with a solution. It's not Rav Sheshet coming up with the solution; it's the Talmud coming up with the solution. And the Talmud, we know full well, has already made a claim about this oath, right? Where did it come from? Right? And that's what it says. Matnitin takanat chachamim. The oath described in the Mishnah, as we already saw from what Rabbi Yochanan said way back in the day, is a rabbinic enactment. Right? It's there for some other principle. There's nothing sort of biblically or theologically necessitating the oath here. The oath is there because of some other problem. Okay? And Rab Sheshet wasn't talking about the situation after the rabbis tweaked things and did other legislation. Rab Sheshet must be talking in the sort of ideal Platonic form of halacha, in which you wouldn't need to take an oath, and therefore don't attack Rab Sheshet from the Mishnah because he was thinking about the halacha before the sages came along and created another enactment. It may not be so satisfying a rejection because, in fact, Rab Sheshet doesn't seem to be in sync with the values of the Mishnah, right? Because Rab Sheshet doesn't seem to think that you need to take an oath. It might be fun at some point to sort of play the game, right? Instead of just thinking of these as legal principles, let's imagine that there's sort of consequentialist legal philosophers for a moment, right? What's different if you're Rabbi Chia and what's different if you are Rav Sheshet here in our case of Halach, right? In a world in which you do have to swear on the rest, presumably Rabbi Chia is a little bit of a pessimist about human nature and thinks that borrowers are likely to have to behave badly, and therefore we need to impose oaths on them in order to prevent them from doing that. Yeah, Sandra.
Well, I was thinking it may be a case of rate of exchange. You say, here's 50. Maybe the exchange rate is changed or they're using a different type of money.
So it's very interesting that you say this. The fourth chapter of this tractate is all about that question, right? It's called Perek HaZahav. And it treats these cases of exactly that, of what happens if I trade gold coins for silver coins. First of all, when I trade gold coins for silver coins, which is the money and which is the object being purchased, since they're both money, right? And then, exactly right, what happens if I borrowed dinars when the exchange rate with sellers was at a certain amount, and now the exchange rate has differed? Do I have to pay back in dinars or do I pay back in sellers, right? All these questions the Talmud knows about and is pretty sophisticated about. And I remember when I studied that chapter in rabbinical school, there's someone who really, really struggled with Talmud and was deeply frustrated. But this person had been a currency exchange trader in a previous life. And when we got to that topic, this guy was far and away more talented and was able to explain it to everybody else. And we were all so confused, right? So exactly right. So here, I'm not exactly sure, although we will see if we get there. Yeah, a little bit farther down the page, we'll see a hint of this, of different exchange rates. I think I would say that in this case, the Talmud is less thinking here about actual cases and is more really digging deep on the oath, no oath case. And so has sort of constructed cases and isn't quite yet introducing exchange rate issues. But we'll get there. Actually, eventually, if we ever get to the fourth chapter, there's some really cool historical data, because the Bavli and Yerushalmi totally differ on which is the money currency and which is the object currency. And actually, a scholar named, I'm going to forget his name at the moment, will come to me. used Roman history and showed that a particular Roman emperor so devalued the gold currency of his time by diluting it, that it wreaked havoc on the exchange rate between gold and silver coins. And the Talmudic textual difference is a reflection of this real crisis that happened sometime in the early 3rd century, when gold Roman coins were devalued so much, such that the Talmud sort of inadvertently reflects monetary 3rd century monetary policy. And you can actually learn a great deal about how, I guess, yeah, I always get confused between monetary policy and fiscal policy, but whatever, right? That the Romans had much less of a grasp on what would happen when you devalue certain currencies, that it actually wreaked havoc in the market, and Talmudic law had to rejigger itself in order to address the situation.
So
Okay.
I was
Yeah.
thinking it's not really a lie or an attempt to cheat the other person. It may be something really
Good.
viable.
Right. Interesting. But then how would you explain the sort of here you go? Here it is. I only had 50 and it's yours. In other words, he's saying that when I borrowed it, it was worth a certain amount, but now it's no longer worth a certain amount.
It's devalued. So I'm giving
Right.
you what I owe you.
What I owe you. Yeah, it could be. I totally see why you would say that. Yeah, Dara, you want to get us out of this?
Yeah,
morass?
no, I don't know if one thing I was wondering about is, I don't really agree with Rabbi Shesheth because
Okay.
The person who says, yes, I owe you 50 and here it is, when he's saying those words, the 50 are still in his hands. And he's still, even though he's giving them, he's at the moment that he says it, it's still in his possession. And, saying here it is doesn't mean it's yours, it's not mine. You know what
Yes, I
that
do.
interpretation doesn't seem right to me.
Okay, good. Me neither. I mean, I think I'm on Rabbi Chia's side as well. Right. Now, there's still a problem. Rav Sheshet still has this person giving that which they owe, and given that the tovea, that the plaintiff cannot produce any proof, right? Again, hamotzi mechavero alav haraya. If you want to take money out of somebody else's pocket, the burden of proof is on you, and he's got nothing, right? So why is it that we're making this person swear an oath on with what proof does this person have? Could you just walk up to anybody and say, you owe me $100 and start forcing them to swear to God right and left? Right. So you could see to some degree why Rav Sheshet says, listen, they both agree that he owed 50. About the other 50, they disagree, and neither one has any proof. So we're going to leave it in the person's hand. But I agree with you that this word helach, that Rabbi Chia's approach seems to make more sense than Rav Sheshet's.
Well, can I just say one thing? If that's,
of course.
if they agree, if he has no proof and they disagree on the other 50, then it goes back to the same situation of the two people holding the same garment, except just with the other 50, not with the 50 that he's saying here.
The difference is, what we've pointed out is, the only reason why we make them take oaths in that situation is to prevent some other kind of societal ill. Lest random people start going up and grabbing onto other people's baseball caps and saying, mine, 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 and then having to split it, right? That'll lead to utter lawlessness. Right? That's why we impose the oath. We don't impose the oath because we actually think that there's a legitimate claim. We just know that if we start telling everybody the Jewish law says, anytime you show up in court with two people grabbing an object, you split it, that's going to lead to widespread fraud. And in order to prevent that, we make people take oaths.
Well, then
That's
to follow
from
that, maybe you should make both sides swear. You should make the one who's saying you owe me 100 and the one who says, no, I only owe you 50, and both should swear.
But they know that one person is going to be swearing incorrectly. They don't want to make,
Yes, that's
They
true.
don't
One of
want
them
to
is
make-
gonna lie.
they don't want to make you lie. That's part of their concern.
That's right. And that takes us all the way back to Rabbi Yossi, who said, why are we increasing Shavuot Shav? Why are we creating a situation where we know there are false oaths being taken? Right? It's one of the 10 commandments. Why are we encouraging people to take false oaths? To which we then respond, well, maybe they're not. It's at least theoretically possible they both on the talus at exactly the same time. And once it's theoretically possible that they're not lying, then we're not so worried about it.
So, but we agreed that the Talmud was more concerned about preventing people from lying, from trying to take advantage of other people than the person who was telling the truth.
I think that's right. The other concern, of course, and this is something that's sort of lying in the background, is, as the Talmud will say, shalotin ol delet bifnei lovin, in order that the door should not be slammed in the face of potential borrowers. Right? Given that lenders are lending without interest, if I know that I lend people money and then there's some chance that I'm going to, one, not get paid back, and two, have to swear to God about things, then I'm going to say, screw it. I'm just never going to lend anybody money anymore. I mean, haven't we all had the situation where you lent somebody a book and it comes back ruined, or you lend somebody a car and it comes back with a scratch, and you say, that's it. I'm never lending ever again, right? The Talmud knows that in the world in which there are poor people and people come on hard times, and especially in the agricultural world, when the crop doesn't come in, people need to borrow money. And anything that would lead creditors to just say, screw it, I'm never going to lend anybody anything, that's really bad. Access to capital is really important. And so that's another concern, right? And that's probably why we don't just say, we'll make them both swear, because we tend not to want to impose oaths on creditors, because that's going to decrease the likelihood that people are going to want to lend.
Rabbi, I'm sorry, so to go back to this, if we agree that hilcha, is that?
I would say helach.
Helach. If helach means, according to Rav Sheshet, that the money that the debtor has in his hands is about to be given back to the creditor, then it's internally consistent, as Dara was saying, and you were saying, that there is no more debt because there's no proof of the debt.
Right.
What's the problem that the Gemara raises? I still don't understand that with Rav Sheshet.
Well, the problem that the Gemara raises against Rav Sheshet is that our mission, Rav Sheshet, it says, because there's no debt and then we don't impose an oath upon him. Right.
And what is the Mishnah? And I'm sorry, I know we went over
and the
it.
Mishnah, the assumption is that our Mishnah is somehow parallel to this case, right? That the fact that when you're holding on to half of the garment, that I'm also holding on to, that's kind of like me saying helach to you.
Right. But why isn't the Gemara saying here, or a comeback to say, it's not like the Mishnah?
Well,
it's a different situation where one person now has the talus, the other one has let go completely.
Yes, I agree with you, and I think we're going to get there. But remember, the reason why we started connecting these things was because Rabbi Chia said they were connected.
Right. Okay.
So we are still assuming that this is the case, that Rabbi Chia is using our Mishnah as support for it. And if Rabbi Chia is using our Mishnah as support for it, so then it's got to be parallel. So that if we were to then say, but it's not parallel, then we're going to be back to square one with regard to Rabbi Chia. So I would argue that in some sense, it's despite the fact that Rav Sheshet sort of has placed a wedge between these cases, right? We're still kind of committed because we've already proffered that these two things are the same. So as long as we continue down that road that they're potentially the same, we're going to go that until we can't anymore. But I agree with you. They're really not exactly the same kind of cases, unless we radically change what we think helach means. And it would seem to me that Rabbi Chia and Rav Sheshet are really disagreeing about what does that mean, right? And I think the way we might want to understand Rav Sheshet is by saying they're yours, they were never mine, right? They're really in your. I never took it, I never used it, I never exchanged it for goods, and now I'm paying you back with different money. It's really yours. It was always yours. I never really borrowed it from you anyway. Here they are. Something like that. They're still sitting right here. I never took them.
But that's not the only way to interpret that. It could be, here they are. I'm putting them in your hands. I'm walking away. I'm done.
Exactly, and that's what I would say.
That's fine.
That's what Rabbi Chia thinks.
Rabbi Chia is saying, I think there's a third position here. I think the one position is I'm acknowledging that it was only 50.
Right.
The second position is that I never took it. I never borrowed it. I never took possession of it. The third position is I really did borrow it. I never did anything with it. I'm putting it back in your hands. This is all I ever borrowed.
Right. But
now since it's in your hands, it's not even in my hands anymore.
It's not even in my hands. Right. Right. I'm not quite sure how strong the difference between 1 and 3 are. I see the difference between 1 and 2, but how is 1 and 3 different?
Well, 1 and 3 is I'm still holding on to it.
Uh-huh.
It's possession. The other one, I let go.
I let go. Got it. Right.
I've paid you back. The interaction is over. There's no further debt. The case is moot.
Right. Right.
It's just, I'm just thinking.
No, you're absolutely right. And by the way, just sort of for future thought, this is precisely the kind of question where we would go to the medieval authorities, right? The Rishonim, anything we can think about, and this was one of my favorite things to do when I was teaching rabbinical students, is we'd spend a lot of time on a case like this, going around the room, having people figure out what they thought halach was and what it meant. And you'd end up with 3 or 4 opinions. And then you'd assign all of the medieval authorities, and it would turn out that, this student agreed with Maimonides, and this student agreed with Rashi, and this one agreed with the Ramban, right? Any reasonable, and I guarantee you, Sandy, that we're going to find some medieval authority who says precisely what you've said, right? Because there are only so many logical situations that we could come up with, right? And I find that kind of empowering, right? That somebody 800, 900 years ago was studying the same text and came up independently with the same clever way to read it in order to make it make sense and to go down that road. So absolutely. Okay. All right, we'll go just a little bit further, okay? To which, right, once we've defended Rav Sheshet by saying, no, come on, that's not a challenge. The Mishnah is not a challenge to me. The notion that the Mishnah requires taking an oath, that's not a big deal because that's just a rabbinic enactment, okay? Well, now we have to figure out, well, that's a good point. That is how we had how we read the Mishnah. What would Rabbi Chia say to that response if he were alive to respond to it, right? To which we say, V'idach, Rabbi Chia, okay? He would say, in Takanat Hachamim, it's true, it is just a rabbinic enactment. Umihu, however, I amrat bishlama midoraita helach chayav. Right? If you were to say that according to the D'oraita situation before the sages came along and instituted an oath in our Mishnah's case, right? However, you might say that from D'oraita case in the biblical model, Helach would be chayav, right? So then that's precisely why the sages made the takana in our Mishnah, mitakane Rabbanan Shivua ke'ein d'oraita. It was in fact as a sort of parallel to the Helach case, about which Rabbi Chia thinks you have to take an oath. Well, it was sort of precisely on that kind of model that the sages came along and instituted an oath, just like the d'oraita oath. Okay. So in other words, Rabbi Chia is able to sort of turn this on its head and say, yeah, absolutely. Our Mishnah is a rabbinic enactment, but it doesn't prove that I'm wrong about Helach. exactly the other way around. That proves that I'm right about Halach. That shows that Halach was the source or the inspiration for the sages coming on and making the obligation to swear when it comes to the talis case, right? But the other way around wouldn't make sense. But if it were really for in the case of Halach that midoraita from the Torah without the sages that the Halach case you don't have to take an oath. Well, then, mitakne rabbanan shavua deleta dekavata deoraita. Would the sages come along and create some random oath that didn't have any kind of Torah precedent? Right? Obviously not. And so this is an interesting sort of claim that's being made here, that when the sages make enactments, they don't just do it willy-nilly, right? That the Torah is the model. And when the sages do it, they do it in the same guise as the way the Torah would do it. Okay? Yeah, Dara.
It seems like a circular argument to me.
Okay. Yeah, I agree. So, what's bothering you about it?
Well, it's like teleologic reasoning. It's like, oh, well, of course, this is an oath because the rabbis would not have done it if it weren't, instituted in the Torah. And so therefore, I mean, it's like when you've run out of all the other things that make sense, this is like what you could say at the end.
And I think that's exactly what's going on. I mean, if you take what I've said seriously, that this is not really Rabbi Chia defending himself and Rav Sheshet defending himself. This is because we, the inheritors of both Rabbi Chia and Rav Sheshet, have a commitment to them both being logically consistent, even when we think there's a problem with them, right? We're trying really, really hard to, in Hebrew you say lahatzdik, right? To justify in the absolute sense of that term. That's right. We want to make them make sense. And in fact, I do think that this, what's lying behind this is that the Talmud really thinks that there's an independent reason in our Mishnah why there should be an oath, right? And in fact, it's a totally different case from the case that we're now asserting is a parallel case. And I think you're right. And I think sort of you and Sandy are getting in some ways at the same point, which is the problem is the assertion that these two cases are parallel. They're not parallel. And if they're not parallel, then maybe the reason for the oaths or the reason why in one case there should be an oath in the other one there shouldn't, right, is because they're different cases with different concerns. Okay, and the problem here is that we've shoved a square peg into a round hole in trying to assert that they really have to be the same. And I think to some degree, this is how the Talmud gets there, right? Comes to determine that these cases are different, right? But it's only when the only when we're forced to make these really forced responses that we see, okay, maybe these cases really aren't as similar as we thought they were to begin with.
Right.
So
Rabbi,
right.
If you've already covered this, and I'm sorry, but the words, if you maintain that according to biblical law, the offer of here they are carries with it an oath, what biblical law are they talking about, or are they citing?
Right. So first of all, this notion midoraita does not literally mean in the text of the Torah.
Oh, okay.
Okay. It means the theoretical system in place before the rabbis tweak it to fit their needs. You might think about it in terms of sort of federal law and state law or something like that. So that with the way they're using midoraita according to biblical law doesn't mean literally I can find something in the Torah. It means the situation, the theoretical situation before the rabbis get access to it. This is actually a really important point, I think, in rabbinic Judaism. There are all kinds of things which are midoraita that are not in the Torah at all. For instance, the notion that tefillin have to be black. It is midoraita, tefillin have to be black, right? If you showed up in shul wearing hot pink tefillin, right? No way, got to take them off. Okay, never says this in the Torah. And in fact, there's another sort of principle called halacha leMoshe miSinai, right? A law given to Moses on Mount Sinai. Even if it's not written in the Torah, it is midoraita. It is
in the spirit of, or
in
something
the
like
spirit
that.
of the Torah, or it is
Tacit,
divine.
Tacit, yes.
Yeah, divine as opposed to human, something like that. And in fact, right, so these two categories that we sometimes think of as midoraita and derabanan, that's sort of one dichotomy, and the other one is Torah shebichtav and Torah sheba'al peh, that which is in the written Torah and that which is in the oral Torah. Ironically, something, say, in the prophets is written Torah, but is conceived of as derabanan. Because after all, it was Jeremiah, right, who made a rabbinic enactment. Okay, or similarly, conversely, you can have something which is Torah sheba'al peh, only oral Torah, but is midoraita, that is something that God whispered in Moses' ear, but said, don't write this in the Torah, just transmit it orally. So the rabbis have these systems which can sort of work at cross purposes. And just because it says Torah-idic, right, does not necessarily mean that it's actually a biblical verse that you can go and find and derive from. And I think that shows that the rabbis are sort of systematizing things in ways that are very far removed from biblical exegesis. Okay. So I actually propose that we stop here because there's going to be an attack, which is going to lead us astray to a different Mishnah. And so that's actually a naturally pretty good stopping point. So I think we should stop here and we will carry on next week.
Thank you. Thank you. Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Shabbat Shalom. It's nice that the gang is all
Shalom.
back together. Now we just need Ellen to come back and we'll be at full strength again. All right, everyone. See you next week. Thanks again.
Shabbos.